Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a beer from Evil Twin Brewing Company. It's been a while. I believe the last beer of theirs I reviewed was a sour blue raspberry, but it's been quite some time. So excited to get back in and try another offering from Evil Twin. This one's called Nuts for Nuts. It's an Imperial Stout clocking in at 12% ABV. It's been brewed with honey roasted peanuts, honey roasted almonds, butter toffee cashews, and cashew crunch. I don't know what cashew crunch is, but you know, with everything else in there, I'm sure it's going to be awesome. Evil Twin based in Queens, New York. So label art on this one, it's just got some kind of caramelized candied nuts on there. Really gets you in the mood. I have a sneaking suspicion this is going to work well in a stout format. Now, they did not call this a milk stout on the label. Didn't mention lactose, so I'm not expecting this to be sweet. But we shall see when we get in here. Cracked gently. Poured right in the old stout glass today. Quite dark, quite thick. I'm going to be a bit more aggressive trying to glug it to give it a chance to form a head, but it is quite dark and thick. I don't know how well we're going to get a head going there. Okay, it is slowly rushing up. Very tight, fine carbonation I can see coming up to finally form that head. Just took a few seconds because it is indeed, as I said, quite thick. Visually, absolutely pitch black. It's a 12% Imperial Stout. That's what you would expect. Head looks quite creamy that it did create there. Let's get over this for a sniff. Okay, yeah. So there is a sweetness on the nose. It definitely smells of honey. There's a couple different varieties of honey roasted nuts in here, as well as toffee and candied, whatever. But you do get this sweet honey aroma, but you also get this underlying roasty note coming off of the malt bill as well. So you kind of get a little bit of both. It's not a hugely pronounced aroma. You kind of got to get right up on it and give it a good sniff. But again, it's very thick, so that can sometimes happen. But what I did pick up smells really quite nice. Yeah, all right, without further ado, we're going to jump in and see what this one's about. Oh man, that is a very big beer, both in terms of flavor intensity as well as texture and weight. So we're going to start there. Like I said, before I even get to anything, I didn't see that this said it was a milk stout, or did they make a mention of a lactose addition on here? But there was a definite sweetness to it, so I would suspect that this is actually a milk stout. When I go into Untapped, I'll see if they put anything out about this specific beer, but there is a definite sweetness to it. So, texture. This is 12%, and I said as I was pouring it, it looked very thick, so I was intentionally glugging to give it a chance to form a head. It's incredibly weighty and very viscous. If you caught the mead review we just did a few ago, where I was talking about how absolutely thick and viscous and almost syrup-like, especially in comparison to most beers, that mead was, this is along that same line. This has one of the most intensely thick, viscous, resistant mouthfeels I've ever felt on a beer. 12% is not a low ABV, but I've had many beers way higher ABVs than this that did not come close to matching this absolute intensity of thickness. It's very, very thick. And yeah, it is thick. It's also very heavy. It's very weighty. This is a heavy body with a thick, viscous mouthfeel. In terms of agitation on the palate, you're not really getting any sense of anything other than just the incredible thickness. It doesn't feel silky. It doesn't feel effervescent, really. You can just really feel just what a substantive beer this is on the palate. It's really, really nice. And the body and the mouthfeel go very well together. So now we'll jump into the flavor profile. I did obviously pick up big notes of sweetness. Frankly, even though it may not say it on the label, I would expect with, you know, kind of these candied and sweetened nuts that they put in this stout, that going the milk stout route, adding a little lactose in there to let them speak, tastes like the additives they put in, is probably a good route to go. If you've ever had any Neapolitan flavored or Neapolitan ice cream flavored milk stouts, Those are very sweet by design, so you can really pick up clearly the strawberry vanilla chocolate that taste like the sweetened versions of those things. The sweetness is coming from the honey on the peanuts and, of course, the buttered toffee on the buttered toffee cashews in it. So it's got enough to let that taste like the actual additive, and you can really pick it out, but you still get the underlying roastiness from the malt bill itself. It's not as intensely roasty popping through as you get on some, but it's still there if you're paying attention. So there's actually quite a lot happening in terms of the flavor profile. It's got 4 very different and distinct additives. I'm going to jump back in for a second sip, pick this apart again, make sure I'm not missing anything in the flavor profile. Then we're going to come back and talk about this finish. That's a big one. So yeah, you do get this big intensity of sweetness right up front. It's very honey, coming from the honey roasted nuts that are in there. And you can really pick out distinctly the different nuts they put in there. It's a blend of cashews, almonds, and peanuts. And you can taste all of those 3 different nuts distinctly. Of course, peanuts being a legume, the oddball in there, but that notwithstanding. They all have a very distinct flavor, and you can pick them all out very clearly. The peanut really pops through. It absolutely tastes like a honey roasted peanut. The almonds as well. I've never had honey roasted almonds, but you can really taste that almond flavor kicking through. Of course, they put in 2 different varieties of cashews, and the cashew comes through. So they all have their very uniquely their own flavor profile, and I am very pleased to report that even with 4 different candied varieties of these nuts, they all do have their own voice, and they really play a part in here. One thing I could say is I do kind of wish maybe the balance between the honey roasting and that butter toffee cashew, that maybe they added just a little bit more of the butter toffee cashews to let it come through a little more clearly. I can taste the cashew itself, but I'm not really picking up anything in there that tastes like butter toffee. The honey roasting side of those nut additions, it's just paired with what I presume they added lactose. The sweetness overload is kind of overriding the coating on the cashew, and I absolutely love butter toffee. I think if I could taste that in this, that it would be an even better beer for my perception, and I think that it would help balance it a little better. I'm not saying I think this is poorly balanced. Indeed, I don't. I just would have liked maybe a little bit more emphasis on the butter toffee cashews. Obviously, it's probably the most expensive ingredient they put in here, regardless, but just a little more, especially to let that butter toffee coating pop out, just like I can independently taste all the nuts themselves. But it's very, very nice. So yeah, as I alluded to it, I do think this is very well balanced, certainly well above average. Minor nitpick with the butter toffee, but I do think that it would be even better if I could really taste that aspect of that additive. In terms of the finish, this one's not particularly long. It's definitely sweeter than I thought it was going to be up front. And really, you only get within the first 5 to 10 seconds that underpinning of that roastiness from the malt bill. And it is quite subtle in comparison to these sweet additions that they put in there. This is much more dominated by a sweet profile to this beer than anything else. So the roast is there, but you really got to be kind of thinking about it and paying attention for when it kind of pops up. And it does seem to have these classic kind of earthy underpinnings to the roast, but it's really overdriven by the sweetness of the beer itself and the sweetness on the additives. And what that does is it doesn't let there be these lingering, intense roasty notes or bitters that are typically the driving factor you're going to find in something like a big Imperial Stout. Indeed, that is by far the norm, and in this beer, it does not have a particularly long finish. There is the slightest, faintest residual suggestion of that roast on the back of the palate that flits away finally about 30 seconds in if you're really paying attention to it. But you got to dig through the intensity of the sweetness of this beer to really pick it out. It's there, it's discernible, but it's very subtle and it's very faint. So yeah, not a ton of mileage on this. For what it is, it's probably about average, but it's not one of those really lengthy push out, get a ton of mileage on each sip beers. I'm going to take my time and sip on this one, come up with my scores, When we come back, we'll get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. So before we even get into the rankings, this segment is going to be a little bit longer than the norm because there are some pretty important things we need to talk about with this beer. I will preface this with, I'm not beholden to any brewer, and I am strictly looking at this through the lens of my personal experience. But I did mention as we were going through it that it tasted quite sweet. Upon research, that was not by design. There is not lactose in this beer, which points to a fundamental underlying problem with at least this batch. I've had, not quite to the same level, but I've had experiences like this with other beers in the past. And look, brewing is not easy. If you brew at home, you know how hard it is to get everything exactly how you want. But, everybody should remember, no matter what industry you're in, if you're going to send something out the door with your name on it, that's literally your reputation, if it's not up to the standard. But nonetheless, so the important points here. Evil Twin Brewing Company, Nuts for Nuts, Imperial Stout, 12% ABV. Based in Queens, New York, Evil Twin. This one brewed with honey roasted peanuts, honey roasted almonds, butter toffee cashews, and cashew crunch. So the aroma on this really wasn't super pungent. You had to get right up on it to get the aroma out of it. When you did, it smelled nice. You could really smell the honey from the honey roasting, but it was very much kind of a sweet, dominant aroma. But you could also pick out the nuts, which was quite nice. I could very distinctly smell, the underpinnings of the additives. It just wasn't super pronounced. So the aroma was just average on this one. It gets a 5 out of 10. For the taste. The taste, had this been a milk stout, would have been pretty good, certainly above average. There were a few little aspects as it was kind of settling and I was sipping on it coming on with my scores. I was thinking, there's something about this that just isn't quite right to my palate, even though it had a lot of positives. So we'll start with the positives. The positives being the additives. Really nice bill of additives. And you really could pick out individually the flavors of all of those nuts. Though, and I mentioned this when I was sipping on it for the first few times, I would have liked a little bit more of that butter toffee. I stand by that. But overall, if this were a milk stout by design, taste would have been certainly well above average. The problem with this was it was a very sweet beer, and this had no lactose in it. So there is an issue with fermentation. It did not complete. That is the only way that a beer with these additives like this would be sweet without a lactose addition. The yeast didn't complete the job of fermentation. Doesn't matter that you have honey roasted this and that and the other. Of course, it has an impact on this specific beer, but typically that's another sugar source. So it could be a problem with the yeast strain, could be just not enough time in the barrel. I couldn't tell you, but that to let it out the door for my money is a pretty big deal. That's a quality control issue, and there should be standards in place. If you mess up a batch, don't ship it out with your name on it. Just dump it. Sometimes you take a loss, but it is what it is. This shouldn't have been to this level of sweet. Maybe a slight bit of sweetness, because yeast is never really going to 100% eat it all, but something. More yeast, more time, dial back the amount of additives, but it was almost off-puttingly sweet, almost puckeringly so, and not by design. So really, I can only give the taste, even though I did enjoy what I got, an average score, because it should not have been that way. So, and I think that's being kind. Taste gets a 5 out of 5. Onto some positive aspects. The body on this was absolutely huge. Really, really impressive. Even for a 12%, I mean, I've had beers multiple ABVs higher than that weren't this robust. The body was spot on. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, very similar story to the body. It was hugely impressive. We were just talking about that Moonlight Meadery's Virtue, how incredibly thick and viscous it was. This was along that same line. I mean, just incredible resistance paired with that really big, robust body. Mouthfeel also gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this one, it was really just average, and frankly, it was a little bit too sweet. If the fermentation had completed And there were a lot more of the roasty, earthy underpinnings that are going to leave some residual bitters typically on the palate. The finish probably would have been longer, but on this it was really just average. You know, it wasn't short, wasn't long, just middle of the road. Finish gets a 5 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one was very, very thick. It formed a little bit of a head in the beginning, but it collapsed pretty quickly here. Didn't really have much staying power. Head and retention only gets a 2 out of 10. For the appearance, another positive. The appearance does get a perfect 10 out of 10. It was absolutely pitch black. Balance. Now, despite the at least in my experience, faults with this specific beer, I got to say what they did with it in general for the balance was very, very good. So if I'm just looking at the malt bill in tandem with the additives and the additives each having their own voice, I think that it was well above average. For this specific beer, the one thing that I came back to with the additives, I would have liked a little bit more butter toffee to come through, but that I could pick out all of the individual aspects and nuts individually, really quite nice. Now, had this been less sweet and there was more malt interplay in this one, the balance would have been even better, but I did think in general the balance on this, despite the fault, was good, and I did give the balance an 8 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Subjectively, if I had been operating under the assumption and research dictated, yes, this is a milk stout, I would have put this subjectively way higher. But I just can't understand why anybody would send a beer out the door in this state. It really is embarrassing, and it's not, I mean, it's your reputation at stake. This could just be an isolated incident with my experience, but if this was any pattern with this specific beer or batch, shame on you, brewer, shame on you. I can't give it any higher than a 5, even though I did enjoy what I got. After I found out this is not a milk stout, there's a problem with this beer. So 5 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, this was not supposed to be a milk stout. And had it been a milk stout, it would have been a very, very good example. But it isn't. And we come full circle again. Problems with the batch. For my money, it isn't worth it. And I can't rate this particularly high for that very reason. So example of the style gets a 3 out of 10. Which brings the total score on Evil Twin Brewing Company's Nuts for Nuts to a 63. So 63 is, in the grand scheme of the typical beers I review, quite low. I've really only had a handful down in this range or lower. And look, you know, accidents happen, stuff happens, but you've got to have people in place that are testing beer, quality controlling it, before you start to bottle it and send it out of your plant. I mean, that should never have happened. So maybe there's some failure in the production line. Somehow this one got overlooked. It didn't get pulled. Maybe devil's advocate, this is actually a milk stout. And they meant to mention on here that there's lactose added or anywhere else that you can find information about this beer. But I didn't find it. So look, it is what it is. I don't want to beat the proverbial dead horse here. But that was my experience, and you should at least know that if you're considering looking at this beer. If you do like really sweet beers, really sweet, astringently so, milk stouts, this easily could be one for you. And the additives were really quite nice. So I'll leave it up to beer drinkers' discretion, but that was my experience, and that's how the cards played. Folks, I sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. As always, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications, hit the bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Till next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.